I'll try some history and science again tonight. Let me give you a new, fairly eccentric and outside the mainstream view of the history of history and the nature of history. And we'll start off as always, or perhaps not always, but a lot of times, in pretending that I'm talking about what I'm talking about. And then for those of you people getting this on tape at other times and other places away from this time and this place, you'll have to figure out. There's a couple of quotes that I'm taking, I guess, some liberty with, probably, but having to do with history to start us off. And one of them has to do with, again, the power of words, but the way it's not normally recognized in the complexity, to the degree of the complexity to which you should see it. And one of them is that, and we'll play like I'm quoting somebody, but it was somebody ordinary, it's nobody extraordinary, that history is not what happened, but what is said to have happened. But specifically, to start off with, what I wanted you to consider was how this parallels each person's life. How it specifically parallels your memory. And now let me ask you, at least do you really think I'm going to start talking about history? Well, people that's been around here know I'm not going to talk about history, really. But at least any of you think I'm about to talk about history. Like history, well, we could start talking about for the last 4,000 years and we'd never catch up. But as far as history, or history paralleling your memory and your life, how far back is history? How far away from you is the history? How far away from you now is your memory of you? And if we were drawing a line of time, and this was the past, and this is the future, and we're talking about you personally now, how far away is the history of you from you? I mean, are we going to say that, all right, well, let's say that you're going to call the president just arbitrarily over here. And if we're going to do that, let's say, then to you, where is the past? Where is your history? Way back here? Think about it a second. The answer is no. If you observe where your history is, are you ready? It's right there. It's pushing right against you, is it not? When you walked in and sat down tonight, the history of you, it's like it's somebody right behind you pushing on you. And I don't mean just what happened 5 minutes ago that somebody almost hit your car. No, I'm talking about stuff maybe that happened in 1956. Or some of you are old enough as you should be, happened to you in 1948. That something's already pushing on you. Still pushing on you. So back to the quote that history is not actually what's happened, it's what is said to have happened. Now I ask you where I started this, do you see any parallel between that statement and your conception of the history of you? Or we can start off simpler. Do you see any possible validity to the first statement? The quote that I apparently plucked from the ordinary world, that history is not what actually happened, it's what is said to have happened. And we'll assume that you are not wired up enough to be a run-of-the-mill critic and cynic in life's employ, that you're going to say, well, yeah, but that's no big deal, because everyone, including historians and all academics, but historians, there is prejudice, they have their own axes to grind, as same as everyone else. And an Arab is going to recall history and going to write history in his favor, whereas a Jewish writer is going to remember, to recall, to convey history in another way vis-a-vis their relationship, and so on and so on. So on and so on, your mother. That isn't what I meant. But that's a fair reflection. Very crude. That's okay for kindergartners, but I'm not here to talk to kindergartners. Not after I spent $3.95 on how to improve your vocabulary book. I don't want to deal with cheap people after I spent the big bucks to learn, what was that, Constantinople. I'm up to that. Constantinople. Well. Consider it this way, though. what I want you to see was, if I said now, instead of academic history, instead of the history of mankind, we're talking about your conception of your history, that is, your life. Is it what has happened to you, or what is said to have happened to you? Now, still, if you were an ordinary person, I'll speak for ordinary old world intelligence, a person could say, well, wait a minute. If you're trying to really get sly, you're probably saying that the actual events of an individual's life is not exactly, necessarily, specifically, the way in which the person remembers them. And so you're going to have individual that kind of prejudice, that kind of selective recall. And so you're going to have a mixture of what actually happened and what is said to have happened and what you remember to have happened. And to that I say, come on. You can beat that. I got to suggest to you, I suggest you look real strongly that insofar as, quote, what actually happened to you almost does not come into the melange, to the potpourri, to the mixture that seems to make up, that you would think ordinarily would make up your conception of your history. Think about it. Things that have happened to you at the ordinary level, which happened to everybody, and that you were conscious of them, you were intelligently aware of them at the ordinary level when they happened. Something that happened, a business that failed, a love affair that went astray, a loved one that died. Let's talk about years ago. Try and see this. Is it the actual event, as sad as it may have been for a loved one, a family member that died? Is it actually the death, that is the event of that person, your mother or father or brother dying? Is it that event? Or is it what is said to have been that event? Now, insofar as the part of the quote, is it simply what is said to have happened? Now we're not going to talk about their outside writers and recorders, not historians. We're talking about guess who, Bunky? We're talking about you. The dialogue inside of you has told you what the history was. Don't blame it on anybody else. Well, unless, of course, you know how to get your hooks into Larry, which none of you know how to do, so forget that for the time being. You look for the source, and the source of your history is your own dialogue. It is what you have said has happened. Of course, you didn't say it, but to start us off, it is what you have said has happened. There is another quote that history is the record of unchangeable events. And I got no idea what ordinary person, why life ever moved some ordinary person to say that, if indeed they said it, because I don't think I made it up. But I'm pretty sure that some ordinary person one time said that. Maybe his tongue slipped, but it was written down. I didn't hear it, I read it somewhere. But at any rate, but life some way had or allowed one guy to say, history is the record of unchangeable events, which is, at any rate, I like it. But now let's consider, or should I point out more why I like it? Some of you chuckled, you must like it. It's simple and direct to the point of almost wanting to stagger one a little bit intellectually, but then you can think, well, it's silly. I mean, it's beyond self-evident. Why would anybody even bother to say it? What is history? Except stuff that's already happened, so you can't change it. Why would anybody bother to say? But then you think about it. It just seems to roll, not just on the tongue and the larynx, but through the brain, that history, the record of unchangeable events. And then you think about it a little more, you think, well, all right, as opposed to what kind of event? Anything that's happened you can't change, right? Now back to our real world. How might that parallel one's memory of oneself? How true might that be vis-a-vis memory? Not just history now, but what if we tried to say about a man's memory as a record of unchangeable events? Really? You don't say. So that's the kind of memory you have, eh? A steel trap. which would not really be the case if this indeed were true about you. It'd be more like a matter of walking around rigor mortis. It'd be the ossification. It would be the fossilizing of one's memory, if indeed you had a record of unchangeable events. Again, from the ordinary view, somebody in the old world could say, well, that I was just trying to get slick again, because history does change. They revise history. That which was taught 20 years ago regarding certain things is no longer taught. Sure, all of you know that from out me dragging up an example. History is continually revised, and not just politically, not just some society that takes on a new leader and he almost banishes the old leader from the history books. They do that. But I'm talking about in areas that seem to have a certain amount or a great amount of intellectual freedom. It's because apparently new information comes up, or a revisionist, a historical revisionist comes along. He says, well, I now find, there's my conclusion, that the records upon which this was based about such and such events preceding the Trojan War, we have decided were absolutely spurious, and so therefore even what I wrote 20 years ago is now subject to revision, blah, blah, blah. Not just that. No. What you are harboring is a historical revisionist. But memory seems to be what? Back in the old world, it would be. They could take this. They could adopt this variation of that quote I gave, that memory, they might want to throw in, or I'll throw in for them, an intelligent man's memory. How about that? That normally gets everybody's attention. Everybody wants to salute. Yeah, I didn't know you were talking about me. You know, they'll set their beer down for a minute and go, yeah. And I said, well, even better yet, I guess, is a wise man, but you don't hear that often in bars. But if I said, listen to this quote, a wise man, they'd all want to stand up. I say, a wise man's memory is that which records unchangeable events. And everyone would try and look like the, I guess, head on a Roman coin that, yes, that's me. What is it? Is memory any more a recalling, a recording of unchangeable events than history is? All right. Should it be? Could it be? That is in the best interest of life. If you recall that even machinery has to have play. There has to be tolerances. There cannot be absolute fitting between gears, between any part of a piece of machinery. Not that we are necessarily a part of, that we are machinery, but we are part of a living system. That one part touches other parts, and that all parts eventually are affected by all other parts. But you cannot have machinery of any kind. You cannot have viva systems. You cannot have living systems wherein there is no tolerance. But if you ask, would not an intelligent man's memory, once he had the facts, of course, he would simply accept it. That he would register the facts, he would record them. And he would not come along through some petty fit of self-interest at some later date and disrecall it. Not a wise man, not just an intelligent man. Now I ask you, would that be an intelligent man? Not from his view, not from an individual view, but now what some of you suspect and glimpse having to do with the nature of life itself growing, would that be healthy? Would that be in the best interest of life? That people would see something, people experience something, people have something that goes into intellectual memory and by God is unchangeable. Would that be in the best interest of life? Think about it. All right, think about this. Would it be in an ordinary man's individual best self-interest? I'll never forget. There I was. I'd just gone out of town. I was in Peoria, and my sister called. I left a number there at the bus station, and she called, and just as soon as I said hello, she just up and said, Mama died. And I relive that every time I can think about it. I can see a phone booth. I can hear somebody say Mama the way that my sister did. And it's like the whole thing never changes. Would that be in your own best interest? If that seems too strong, how about some social, sexual, economic, faux pas, some blunder you made one time. I mean, to the point, it may have seemed small on a cosmic scale, but that you walked in, you got invited to the annual accountant's ball, the masquerade ball, and you took off your pants and backed in the door as a hot cross bun. And everybody just laughed you out, and ever since then you have been humiliated. In fact, you had to go into a new profession, but all you got to do is walk past a bakery and you've got a complete, unchanged recall of how that was. Your whole life has been affected by that. Would that be in your own individual best self-interest? Now how about some of the actual history that I was threatening of history? Our version. Well, of course, I can say it's my version to start with, but I'm assuming that you will join right in and temporarily adopt it, at least for the night before everybody forgets it. But I'm going to start off with a certain amount, again, of some plausible, real historical, ordinary, significant, or basis. Let's take the Western world. At least that take us. The Western world, you could divide up history as being, you get a cutoff line between Homer and Herodotus, as everyone, I'm sure you remember from your high school or undergraduate days, the father of history. But there is a specific, around the corner view. It's not all that weird to start with, but I wanted to point out that there is, indeed, they already point out that Herodotus, I'll just accept this why I picked him, because he's been called the father of Western history. But let me point out a more complex view of why. And then I'll probably weaken and just spill my guts and point out to you that it has some possible usage individually. You could look, I'm just going to start off with the academic perception of history starting with Herodotus, and then consider that before him the only Western historian that even you could call that at all would have been Homer. Plus, using Homer and Herodotus as an alliteration, and I know how much we all enjoy alliterations. You can see a cutoff, though, between storytelling and history. And in fact, I happen to know, I think, that the original Greek word from which we derived history was known as research. That was the meaning of the original word. Now this cutoff, you don't even have to remember anything about the Odyssey, the Iliad, other than how well you slept through class like most people. But more or less, let's make it as simplistic as possible for the launching part. Up until Herodotus, Homer was the outstanding, quote, historian. That is, of supposedly in some way telling the history of those people who moved down into that peninsula and became the Greeks, and of course the Trojan War being the big kind of focal point of a lot of his telling, and then how it spread out. But it was accepted as a kind of history before there was a real term academically of history. But it had to do more with this, that before the historians like Herodotus, before they did research, the basis of history, the appeal of history, was on the ability of the so-called historian, it was on his storytelling ability. That if I could drag out right quick out of the grave Homer and said, hey, did you know right after you, this guy Herodotus and even some more came along, and they said that after doing research, which, did you doing a research? And Homer went, research. A poet does not do research. But if I said, all right after you died, then this other guy came along, another, a Greek, decent fellow, nice beard, good nose, came along, and he's tried to write about the same era, the same background of his people, that is, your people, but he started traveling around and talking to people and asking them, did you actually see so-and-so happen? If not, did your father, did he fight in those wars, or did he ever travel to Egypt? Did he ever go over to where the Phoenicians came from? Did you know anybody? What did they tell you? Then he went. This guy actually went out, the kind of stories you're trying to cover that you call history. He went out, and some of the things he could not find anyone to support some of the things that you just relayed as real history. As a matter of fact, some of the things that you just stated as absolute fact, he's got eyewitnesses that were there, reliable, sober people that said it never happened. Homer would have said, hey, give me a break. I was a poet. Now, he would not have said, you people on tape, at other times and other places, we're getting dangerously close to me not talking about what I'm talking about. Homer would have said, not even the people, Homer would have said what I just said, not as an excuse. He wouldn't have said, well, hey, I didn't know. What Homer represented was not that he did not know, but up to a certain point in the maturity of the human nervous system, of humanity's and yours, the idea that there needs to be specific research, that we're wanting actual, I hate to say it, but facts. That didn't enter into it. That the people who would read or who would hear before the stories, the retelling of the Odyssey and the Iliad, there was not even the term, as I'm suggesting to you, the historical, the name history being equated with research. They were tales, and they were not that dissimilar to the mythological tales. That the intellect of the human nervous system, of humanity and individuals, at that stage, now whether we're talking about 500 BC, or whether we're talking about you, or some human right now, at the age of 10 or 11, that the idea, the appeal of histories, the source of humanity, the source of the universe, plus what happened to us just a few generations ago, how I got here, me personally, my family, how I got here, the interest was not in some way of being privy to specific facts. They would not have understood that, I suggest to you, as I'm going to try to make it a little clearer in a second. And Homer would not have said, well, hey, give me a break. He would not have done it as a cop-out, like, well, I didn't have the resources, or I had a game leg, I couldn't travel like he did. That wasn't it. He wasn't trying. And the people who listened to it, we're talking about, it's not a matter of an audience and an entertainer. Remember that. It's not that Homer pulls something over on the people. You got to remember, they're all dancing together. People don't dance that don't want to dance. People don't dance that life don't make dance. The people accepted the stories, such as the Battle of Troy, all of that, which, you know, is still, I'm not up to date, but it's still, I guess, last I heard, 50-50 argument whether the thing actually occurred, whether some battle took place, but the whole story now that's taken by many people, if all you remember is high school history, it is no longer accepted, if it ever was, that it actually happened as Homer said. We've got guys now that spent their whole life trying to make a reputation just trying to find where Troy was and all that. But that was not the problem, and Homer would not respond, should I dig him up from the grave, that is, from your nervous system somewhere. It would not be an excuse that he didn't know or that the facts weren't there. It was if I described to him, and I could stretch reality where he would have some intellectual perception of what we were talking about now, about what history is, then he would have to say, well, no, that's fine, but I told a story. I didn't just make it up. But what you're calling facts and research, that wasn't my job. Nobody ever asked me. Nobody that I ever told a story to. Once I developed it, once I passed it along and told other people, and I would get a few bucks to show up and do it somewhere, no one ever said, wait a minute, what year did you say that happened? Are you sure that there were 5,000 guys involved with that sailing over there? And if I said, well, that's the story, and if they went, no, wait a minute, my brother was there, and he said it wasn't anything like that. Homer would have said, no one ever said that. That was not the total milieu, the environment of me being, for my time at least, a historian. So I am suggesting, to get us a little deeper into this, that there is a cutoff line that we can take in the Western history between a Homer and a Herodotus. That it went from being, let's still call Homer history because that's all they had, even though if they weren't calling it that then, you can follow what I'm saying. Let's call it that was history for its time. That the history was not based on some appeal, on some need, but it did not seem to be the appeal of the listeners, on the appeal that there was some kind of factual information. Indeed, the appeal, if we were talking about music, it was not the words, it was the melody, it was the rhythm, it was the storytelling ability of the fabulist. It was Homer's ability to weave a tale. And insofar as it was actually based upon, quote, facts, was by and large irrelevant. It may have been, it may not have been, but those who were listening, not just Homer. If I could jump back in history and I suddenly jumped out and Homer in person was right in the midst of it, and I jumped up and I said, wait a minute, you Greeks out there, you seem like decent folks. I want to tell you I'm from another part of the time spectrum. No, never mind all that. I'm from another planet. And I want to tell you people, I'm from a more advanced time, and what he's telling you is not factual information. They would have said, you know, would you get off the stage and let Homer finish? You made him lose the rhythm of the thing. They wouldn't have cared. Now, may I direct your attention, if possible, from speaking about humanity to how about individuals? And individuals maturing in the same way that humanity has matured. At least aged. I'm using matured in a loose fashion. Children, when they want to be talked to, or when they will sit still, when they want you to read to them or tell them a tale at night, or if you're just sitting around with a kid, and you start talking, maybe the kid looks, you know, a truck goes by, big tractor trailer, and it's dragging a Army rocket on the back. He's never seen one or something. Maybe the kid says, what is that? And if you start giving him some kind of factual information, of course, if you've been around kids, if you started just for a second, if you slipped up and said, well, do you know anything about ballistics? Or do you know anything about armaments? And the kid went, and you look and you realize, well, wait, I'm talking to an 8-year-old boy. And you'd go, and then you might start telling him a tale. He might say, is that going to send some men to another planet? Kids, and by kids I mean anybody that hadn't reached maturity yet. We'll get that in a second. Kids, the appeal of hearing humans talk is in the storytelling, not in facts. Now all of you should know that. Don't holler, well, that's self-evident. You never thought about it, and it has a significance. You can use it. The appeal of talking to a kid has nothing to do with research you've done. It has nothing to do with actual occurrences that may or may not have taken place that you relate to the kid. If the kid's going to listen to a human talk, it's on the basis of the attraction, of the energy, of the food, of the storytelling itself. Now, you can say, well, yeah, surely. Right. Then when you get mature, just back in the city sense, back in the old world, when you get mature, you're supposed to expand your interest, to say the least, if you're going to function, beyond that. That Homer is no longer sufficient. It's no longer sufficient for you to be laying in bed at night when you're a little nipper, and you hear this loud noise, and the wind blows in the window, and the curtains wave, and you scream, and your father comes in and says, what is it? You said, I heard some kind of monster. And your father said, that's thunder. And you went, what is thunder? And you said, well, it's like real happy. It's like little happy, you know those little kind of little animals that you see on the cartoon show? And they say, yeah. And he said, well, a lot of them live up in the sky at night, and they get real happy, and instead of just laughing, ha, 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 sometimes they go, boom! And the kid goes, really? And so you explained away lightning and thunder, and say, and then when they get real happy, and they start laughing, one of them goes, boom, the rest of them laugh so hard, they go, ha, 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 and their breath blows, and it blows in your window. So you should be happy when you hear that. And you go, oh, okay. And he says, go to bed and you'll be all right. Now we'll assume, even back in the city, back in the old world, that you should have gone past that point And that somewhere along the way, even perchance, you became interested, maybe just for a couple of 5 minutes worth of reading, but you became interested one time of thought, what is thunder? I know everybody says, well, it's lightning hitting something, but what is it really? And so you run to an encyclopedia and you might spend 5 minutes. But the point is, intellectually, which is what makes you human, intellectually you are supposed to mature past the point that human talk, the energy exchange via words, goes beyond the appeal of the mere rhythm, melody, that is the storytelling ability of whatever is the source that you're exchanging words with. That it's no longer sufficient, as fine a man as your father may have been, is for you to hear him or someone else tell you tales. You're then, just in the ordinary sense, supposed to mature a little bit to the point that you now become interested in facts. That if somebody's going to tell you a tale, they're going to say, well, their little creatures live up in the sky and they make noise. And you say, yeah, my father told me that. So, of course, here you are at the age of 22 and somebody just told you this. And you say, I'm beginning to wonder, what is your research for that? Can you give me the data upon which this is based? Or just give me the book that you read that in? Could I see if it was published somewhere outside and beyond the state mental hospital? There is, for someone attempting to do this, a real explorer, a revolutionary explorer. There is like a beta level. There is yet another level. And people who get interested in doing whatever this is, people who get interested in trying to find out some information, people that feel like that they want to scratch somewhere intellectually, or they want to scratch somewhere that they can't find, and they get involved with what seems to be this kind of activity. Now, they go through the same process. It's in a different key, but they go through the same process. They start right out, and they get always, with so few exceptions that you people constitute a large part of the exceptions right now, they end up attracted to someone who is a fabulist. They have to go through that same process. They end up finding or looking for, most people consider it, of course, a spiritual matter. They end up looking for and finding, if they're, quote, lucky, if they succeed, let me retract lucky, they end up finding a kind of spiritual Homer. They start out interested, even if they don't find an individual, but they start out, many of you have been through this yourself, with interest in magic, extrasensual perception, and all sorts of things that are what? Not based upon, quote, facts in any ordinary sense, and the appeal is on that of the storytelling itself. And if it gets beyond books, if it gets beyond your own wired up imagination to be attracted to such things, then what you normally end up with is a fabulist. Again, it's not anybody fooling you any more than Homer was trying to fool people by his tales of the Trojan War, when there were some people there that could have said, that didn't happen the way you said. That wasn't the point. Nobody but an idiot goes to a movie nowadays and stands up and hollers, wait a minute. Wait a minute. My brother was in Korea. That didn't happen. So people end up, and what seems to be the interest in doing something extraordinary, the energy that they seem to find available. If they end up with some kind of would-be system or a cult or a religious organization or something, you're always going to find that there's going to be a storyteller at the center of it. I'm generally referred to as the head priest or rabbi or cult leader or guru or somebody, and it's on the basis of the appeal of the storytelling. Not that he's trying to fool somebody, but as far as he's concerned, that's the basis of his job. It's no more strange to him. He'd be no more a suitable subject for some accusation than Homer was for me to pop up and tell Homer, hey, you don't know squat about history. Hey, you tell a nice story, cute beard, but history, you don't know. But to tell these people, to tell somebody that has, whoever contributes some of the parts to the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu literature, for me to dig them out of the human nervous system, if not the planet, and say, some of this stuff about there being these guys coming down in chariots of fire and waging war across the plains of the subcontinent, which you take as being the whole planet, and that people would die for 5,000 years, and then certain ones of them, their souls would come back through the ground. Hey, listen, you got people still believing that stuff. And their attitude would be, well, what do you mean believing that stuff? Did I detect a note of hostility or sarcasm or accusation in your voice? What do you mean believe? I told a story. And if I said, yeah, but that's not based on facts, then they'd be sort of in the same position that our Western archetypical figure of Homer was. Like, well, that wasn't my job once I explained to him what facts were. And where'd you get the research? Where'd you get the research for this? You still have, under various guises, some of it still as old as the Hindu literature, but you still have this taking place today of people believing that they're trying to mature at another level, which is what you could call this from one strange view. But you have to go through that same process of starting out with tales of gods, mythology, even that which is presented as a kind of history, but the appeal, that which people get from it, is not on the basis of receiving energy based upon a retelling based of some kind of historical real research. The energy involved, which is all right once you recognize what it is not that it's wrong, the energy is coming from the appeal of the storytelling itself, combined with the appeal and the ability perhaps of the storyteller. And that's it. How else can you, once you get a glimpse of it, how else can you explain the continual powers of religions, of even specific religions, that they can keep retelling the same tale over and over, Sunday after Sunday, or Saturday after Saturday, or Tuesday after Tuesday, for thousands of years, the same stuff over and over and over, and you say, well, how can they do that? You know, at least the fundamentalist churches, these guys try to ad lib a little bit, but to think about, you know, the great orthodoxies of the world, that these rituals, and they say the same thing 5 times a day, or however they have their services, 7 days a week, and people will go there 2 or 3 times a day. They say the same thing, same thing. You say, how they do that? I just told you how. The appeal is, the energy is on the basis of the storytelling. It is on the apparent ability of the fabulist. It's not on any kind of reality whatsoever of the myths. Of course, they don't call them myths, they call them, you know, reality, that we are praying to somebody up here or out there. But it's the same situation that you would have had that in Homer's time. Jumping back to that. Pre-Herodotus, that a Homer would freely mix in what seemed to be history from one view of talking about so-and-so happened, and then suddenly he would mention, and by the way, later that afternoon, Zeus came down and said, hey, a bunch of you people get back there, I'm not going to, you know, you shouldn't have been here fighting, you leave. And some of them didn't leave fast enough, and he fried their toes off. And he just goes on repeating something else. It's not a matter of looking back and saying that they were so dumb that people believe that. Don't ever call humanity dumb, because you're calling life dumb, and life ain't dumb. Life knows what it's doing. But don't call it dumb and say, oh, of course, now we know better. If you're ordinary, you don't know better. They just change the names. They don't pray to Zeus around, at least in Georgia and most of the North American continent anymore. They just change the name of it. And just because you've never seen Zeus come down and fry somebody's toes, if you're an ordinary person now, and you're a good Christian or a Jew, you got stories that are just as weird, because they seem so far away that you don't have to try and defend it like, well, it's not like that our holy book said that this happened last week or 20 years ago and we can go check it. Now, so far back, nobody knows for sure. We're going to accept it. It's not stupidity. I'm trying to show you that there is a cutoff line in the nervous system of humanity, of mankind, and there is one in individuals. And it separates Homer. It separates what passes for history. And history passing for what has happened to humanity, what has happened to me, but what has happened to humanity, and it is no more than an unrecognized, continual potpourri of myth, fable, maybe some facts. And I'm just using all these terms, of course, in the ordinary sense of the words. That is accepted as being history. That is accepted as being your history of what's happened to you as to what has happened to humanity. But then there is a line past that even ordinary people, which humanity as a whole has done it, are supposed to mature a point past that, which is what makes the life of the intellect in the ordinary sense. And of course, even back in the city, the more people seem to be intellectually driven, the more they seem to be in the hands of the cortical language machine of their nervous system loop, their individual one, the least they seem to have any particular interest, much less belief or faith in myths, gods. It's just, that's accepted. People know that, as they used to like to say down in Mississippi, don't let your children go to college because they'll go away Baptist and come back atheist. You know, religion's a danger, education is a dangerous thing to religion, which is not the point. The point is, the more people are driven along certain lines to become participants, workmen for the cortical area of the human nervous system, the least they talk about, the least they entertain the kind of histories that are more endemic to the older, to the more simplistic language areas of the human nervous system. Well, let's turn the tape over. Let's consider this kind of activity, that this kind of activity is a person. Then that person would be a combination, if this was a living entity, which it is, but let's imagine that this kind of activity is just another person. This person would be a combination of Homer and Herodotus. This person would have to be a combination of a historian in the sense of that word meaning a researcher and a poet. He'd have to be both, so he would be a storyteller and he would be a scientist, or she, it, the figure, the person. It would have to be that. It would be the person. The intelligence would have to be a historian, a researcher in the sense that it would not simply be retelling what somebody said had happened. It would have to be on the basis of not just telling in some way what has happened to man, what has happened to mankind, but the nature of what had happened. Closer aligned to what they would consider real academic history now, of delving into the motivations, into how one thing is connected to another, how something that happened in the 1400s was not absolutely isolated from something that happened in 750. So this kind of intelligence would have to be a historian in that sense, a scientist, but would also have to be a poet, and that the kind of the nature of things that would be retelling behind that which apparently has happened to humanity and to humans and to individuals would be on the basis of storytelling, in that it would start dealing with universal tales and not be limited to simple, direct, quote, factual specifics. There would have to be both if this was a person. Now, consider this is a person, and if it's going to live, it's right up above your brain stem. That's the only place it can breathe. It's in you. It has to be both. You can't continue with this. In fact, you hadn't really gotten anywhere. But you can't continue with this if all you are is listening to a dialogue, and the side that seems to be the appealing voice in you is no more than a Homer, a fabulist, which is fine if you understand what it is. It's not that it is per se flawed, because you have got it, you had it when you were a child, and it's still in there somewhere. But is that still the voice? Is that going to end up being your siren voice? Is that going to be what finally dashes you on the rocks of listening to that which can be presented? Because remember, if you were sitting there, if we move time and place back to the Grecian times with Homer, still using him, remember, just archetypically, because I'm sure I'm playing with even the so-called history of Homer. But that which he represents, the way in which I'm trying to sketch this out, if you were sitting there, you would be taking what a Homer is presenting as history. You can't keep doing that. I don't care how appealing it is. If you're going to go hear Homer, if you're going to go hear a fabulist, And of course you don't have to go very far. All you got to do is pull up a chair and sit down. And I don't mean here, I mean at home. Just lean back. But if that's what you're going to do, don't take that as being a Herodotus. Do not take that as finally going past the line to where we're now dealing with a historian being a researcher. It is fables. It is myths. I don't care what they're called. I don't care what the gods are called. I don't care whether they go by the name of Jehovah, Allah, or Neptune. I don't care whether you're still entertaining ideas that Vishnu flies down somewhere across the planet and does things, or he or she did 10,000 years ago, or whether you believe that a Jesus or a Moses did something a little sooner, a little closer in time than that. This is all storytelling. It's not wrong. It has to be. You had to go through it individually. Your children will have to go through it. Humanity continues to go through it, and the history of it is not gone. Remember, history is not way down there. The history of you owning tales told, of someone telling you, hey, those loud noises can't hurt you because it's actually little happy munchkins or whatever having fun. You've got to recognize it for what it is. And when it gets up close, though, to what you believe this kind of activity is, that you think, well, wait a minute, there's a difference between some brand new cult going on, just make a crude example, or there's some guy now that says he is actually in touch with flying saucers, and if we go join up and buy his water purification system, he'll take he'll take us with him when the time comes. Well, as always, I tend to exaggerate and make some of you laugh. But if you believe that there's some kind of new spiritual idea or metaphysical theory going on, and you thought, well, wait a minute, this is different from people in the subcontinent 10,000 years ago believing in these three gods fighting actual battles down on the Incas plains, that this is different. It's not different. It's storytelling. It has great appeal because there is a need in the human nervous system all the way up to the brain, all the way up to where it is now. But you've got to see that is Homer. You've got to see that there is an appeal to storytelling. There's an appeal of storytelling. There are people. Life sends out people continually that make center stage, and sometimes a little off stage, sometimes out in the lobby, sometimes in little off Broadway shows, but they're always around and off times, not passing themselves off as humble vagabonds, minstrels telling a few tales, but as some kind of enlightened spokesman for the gods. But they're still Homers. In fact, they're Gomers, but Homers. But they have appeal. You can go there. You can be intelligent. You can be sophisticated. And you can go there and feel an appeal. And if you were asked about it, you might even give a fair intellectual defense of it later. But you need to recognize what it is. It is not an intellectual. It is not in any way a factual appeal. It is an appeal of fable, and the energy, the further appeal can be from the energy of the fabulist, of the storytelling itself and the storyteller. As I've told you before, with no exceptions, it's all showbiz. And I'm not talking about that. I said it's all showbiz. Likewise, if you begin to understand that you have to have a kind of even second level, a beta level maturity, you got to go through this process beyond that, you still cannot escape it. And there is still a use for it. Not back at that old level, but at a new level, because I got to admit to you, in case some of you hadn't already thought about it, as far as playing the storyteller, what is some of this? What is some of the things I make up? And the little side jokes and the Kairouts, and even me speaking in somewhat of a passionate voice rather than staying here and just talking in a monotone. What is all of that? It is a part of the storytelling. It is a kind of updated fabling, because you cannot separate it. You cannot cut off and say that everything that happened before Herodotus, forget it. You can forget it as being researched history. You can forget it as being in some way factual commentary on what might have happened. But remember history. The first quote I gave you from somebody, and maybe it might have been my brother, that's why I can't think of it, that history is not actually what happened, it's what is said to have happened. Now, after all this, could we go back and could you now see that there is yet another fold, there is another dimension to even that quote, that history is not what has actually happened, but what is said to have happened. What is said to have happened is part of what happened. It is the wrap-up, the unrecognized wrap-up of fabling and research. That once you understand that, there is no question, there is no legitimate, there is no answerable, there is no useful question for the human nervous system to say, wait a minute, I wonder, did a woman, a beautiful woman, or even a woman named Helen, did she actually get captured? And if I say, wait a minute, that's about something, but forget whether it actually happened. And your nervous system went, well, wait a minute, I can't forget. I mean, it could be a fable, but if that really happened, it would have some significance of a certain kind. And if it's just a tale, I mean, if it's apocryphal, it might still be an interesting little story, but it wouldn't be the same. You blow it. It doesn't matter. Well, as long as you understand. It doesn't matter. Because it's not in some way this or that, either or, to take that original, the opening quote I gave you, that history is not necessarily what actually happened, but what is said to have happened. If you understand that, at least up to 5 dimensions, it's inescapable. You are in a 5-dimensional flypaper trap. Because history is not what has actually happened, it is what is said to have happened, which is part of what happened. And so to say, well, wait a minute, I believe this part of so-called history of humanity, and this part I don't believe. All right, now forget that. Now let's get up to date a little closer. You believe part of your life, and part of it you don't believe. You don't necessarily use these terms, but it's like part of your life that happened to you was spurious, specious, an anomaly, unjustified, a black stain on the history of me. One that as soon as my memory calms down, I believe I'm going to put a little spin on it. It doesn't matter. And if you understand that, you got no need for ordinary psychiatry, for religion. Of course, I'm being funny because you don't have much need for anything secondary except as a hobby. But it's not then of believing any further, of thinking any further, that there is some distinct line, like I'm drawing you metaphorically between Homer and Herodotus, that there is some distinct line between actually what happens in life and what some people say happened. What people say happened is part of what happened in life. It is the, perhaps as I suggested to you most strongly, the ultimate triumph of words. What does it, can you begin to suspect that? And remember, any of you getting distracted? Surely not. We're not talking about history at all. What if somebody named Helen, the one that Homer described, never existed? And just him being, you know how arty people are, off on a spree one night and drinking, it just came to him, and maybe he had been, you know, real horny from afar from this girl, that this long blonde hair, and he just kind of threw her in and made up this Helen thing. All right, in other words, if we, as time-dimensional researchers, could go back and just absolutely solve that in the 3D world, there was no factual basis for the Helen capture story regarding the war at Troy. So what? It is now, the words have ultimately triumphed. The words say it is so. Or any other thing. I know I'd already kind of poked holes in that, but anything in history, if we could go back and somebody could prove that factually the guy that they now say is the only William Shakespeare that lived there in the Avon area, that he didn't write this stuff, just like everybody suspected, that you could go back and right quick you could run a time machine and you could see this guy live right fast like a movie, and he never wrote squat. So what? And you're going to come back and say, "Now I know something useful." No, you don't. The ultimate triumph is that he did write that. I picked another one in question. Why do I keep doing that? Roger Bacon wrote, the ultimate triumph is what is said to have happened. And it's not that in some way, quote, history is so prejudiced, is so unstable that we can't depend on it. You're missing the point. You can depend on this. At least still my suggestion. You can depend on this. There may be the ultimate triumph of words. That the words tell you what happened, not just in history books. You tell you what happened. The dialogue tells you what happened to your life, and someone else can come along and say, "Listen, I'm an outside researcher. I'm your friend. I'm your neighbor. And the kind of stuff I hear you talking about now, what happened to you and your first wife, I'm telling you for your own mental health. That did not happen. I was there and that didn't happen. I would like to be Herodotus to your Greeks." And what if you're ordinary, what are you going to say? Give me a break. That is not history. Don't tell me what happened. History is what is said to have happened. In this case, by who? And you'd say, "Well, me." Well, if you're ordinary, you'd say, "Well, by the events. You just don't remember them right." But now if you could just move up one step, and I said, "All right, by who?" Then you might say, "All right, it's by me." That's not what other people said happened to me. That my history of me now is what is said to have happened. I said, "And by who was it said?" And you'd say, "You." And then if you can move up one more level, and I'd say, "All right, by who?" And you'd say, "Whoever it is that's talking through me. Whoever it is that's broadcasting on my channel and tells me this stuff." A little of the promised science instead of staying just with history. Everyone knows this, and I used a piece of this one night, you recall, but everyone knows that in all conversions of forces, energies, all exchanges, that the conversion from one force to another, any exchange of energy, is never 100%. It's never complete. That is a rule, that is a law in the 3D world. Some energy is always lost. What I want you to consider that this is absolutely also true and unrecognized in all verbal exchanges. That something is always lost. Now, one way you can look at it is from several of the forms of ordinary 3D, speaking in the area of physics, of conversions from one force to another, is you can look at it in certain cases as the energy is lost through friction. If you could look at it in a certain way, you could always call it friction. But I was trying to give you some fair high school solid foundation of your memory to start from. Friction. Now, it's still true, what I started out pointing out to you, that there is a loss in all human conversation. The use of words. This great, this absolutely imperative, always eminently needed energy exchange on this planet via human talk. But there is energy always lost, even in human talk, via friction between the interplay of the participants involved. Let's just say two people, to make it simple to start with. There is a friction of transferring, converting the energy inside of one person, passing it on to the other by way of words. There may be other things involved, gestures, the tone of your voice, the proximity of you leaning into somebody, faces you make, all of that. But let's right now call it the transfer via, that the main carrier is by word. There is a friction going on between peoples, between the collection of molecules known as individual humans. you have therefore always something lost. Now when the smaller, the same way as it is in the physical three-dimensional world, the smaller the process, the exchange, then the harder it is, the smaller something is, the harder it is to notice variations in it. That is, if the exchange is, if you're staying there on the street corner next to a stranger and you say, time, and you look at his watch on his wrist and you say, time, and he says, 4:20, and you say, thanks. Now when it gets to that level, you'd be hard-pressed. It'd be even no profit in me trying to even bring it up in some specific way for me to tell you, to prove that something was lost. Because once it gets so small, so simple, so direct, in the same way it is if you're trying to look at something through ordinary three-dimensional technology of microscopes, the closer you get to seeing something, the smaller and smaller it gets. Or conversely, if you're on the side, you'll know this, the larger it gets, the harder it is to see any anomaly, any variation. But to get away from that little small of time, 4:15, you get into something a little more complex. You're trying to talk to somebody. You're trying to talk to your child about why you should not smoke pot, why you should definitely not smoke marijuana and bring drugs into this house. Or you're trying to tell somebody, listen, we've had a great affair, and you just meant the world to me, but I don't know, something's wrong. It's always as though something got lost. And the person says, wait a minute, are you saying so-and-so? You say, well, no. Or in the other case, I'm going to go like, I was following up the love conversation. You're going back telling your child, listen, don't you bring drugs in this house ever again. And then it's like, you get the feeling, though, he didn't hear it. Not completely. And he says, well, wait a minute. Does that include alcohol? You say, I said no drugs. At any rate, you can begin to feel in either case like somebody either misunderstood, or else they don't say they misunderstood, it's like they can't accept it in some way. This is generally just referred to that there is a certain difficulty in conveying what you really mean to people. That there's always a possibility of misunderstanding, or people perhaps have their own agenda so firmly embedded in their own perceptions of the time that they won't hear what you say, and blah, blah, blah. All those kinds of attempted psychological explanations. We're going beyond that kind of poetic level into what should be more factual, that it is not psychological, it is as strong as the ordinary laws of physics having to do with conversion of forces and loss of energy. That this happens always in conversation. And you can look at it as being a kind of friction. Lost through friction. But you could also take a kind of a side scientific note of the power of friction. Looked at another way, that friction can wear down horrendously sized machinery. Friction can wear down. History can wear down the shore, the seashore in an area. Friction can suck the essence out of a conversation. Friction can produce an orgasm. Now, out of those kind of possibilities, since you're faced with friction being inherent in conversations between you and anybody, of those kind of that range of possibilities I gave, what would you think would be perhaps the best way to try and make some use of this inherent situation, this reality of there being loss by friction, that friction is going to be there, and rather it being a loss, at least on your end, how might it be used, since I pointed out things that it will do, can do, do. That is, does do. How about an aside to an aside at least? There's another way to look at the friction. That is the loss that always goes on in human conversation. You could also look at it as like the dealer always getting slipped a couple of bucks for being the dealer. You could look at it as kind of life taking out its cut. You going to play the game, and you're a man about the universe, if not town. The dealer deserves a few bucks, win or lose. That's just the way gentlemen act at the table. Slip the dealer a few, give him a couple of bucks just because he's a dealer. You could look at the loss that whatever kind of exchanges, of course now I'm specifically been talking about verbal, but that whatever's going on when energy is exchanged, it's as though life continually, it's like a percent for me, maybe even 0.5, maybe 2, but it's like no matter how you try to exchange, it's like an unseen hand is always taking out a few bucks, taking a small percentage right off every exchange. I say you could look at it that way. I'm not sure why, but you could look at it that way. You can definitely look at the fact that there is a loss that is inescapably inherent in all three-dimensional conversions, transfers of energies, of forces. It is there. It cannot be escaped. It cannot leave your nervous system. It cannot leave your tongue and reach the other person without some loss. That taken into consideration, I suggest can, perhaps, maybe, could have, might, some possible everyday use. If not poetically, you can consider it a part of very hard-nosed research. You could be Herodotus and go, aha! For years I have accepted these tales of Homer, these poetic storytellings about what's happening, about people trying to talk to each other and convey their feelings and what's happened, and poets are okay, storytellers are okay, but you can't listen to a fabulist with both ears all your life. You might say that, I don't know. Of course, maybe you wouldn't. You might be like the guy that was brought out in the morning for his execution, and they asked the condemned, did he have any final words? And he said, I come to get hung, not make a speech. How about a wrap-up of the friction? At least any of you think I was going to leave your brain cells, some of you sitting on the edge of your seat. The friction, the loss in all conversation. How about how about the loss that is inherent even in talking to yourself, of telling you what kind of guy you are, telling you what you're going to do, tell you what you're in the midst of doing, what you may be partially succeeding at, how you may be ebbing, how you may be flowing. Every time you do it, you are losing some energy, even internally. So maybe when you're inclined, you might recall and tell yourself that you're about to let this dialogue talk to you about what you're doing. You might say, look, I come here to get hung, not to gab. And of course, sometimes you do come to gab and not get hung, but you're to know one from the other. Normally what makes it funny is the former is, the thing is, I come here to get shot, not make a speech. I think we'll end the tape for the night, but since I just know there is such great interest, and although I hadn't heard from anybody, but I know it's just probably the mails being held up, such great interest in our thought for the day, I had another combination, not only the thought for the day, but another in my apparently long, at least continually growing list of possible names that we could never use, since we can't use any name for this, but it seemed another good oleo, a combination deal of the thought for the day and another possible name for this. That's don't whine. Did anybody catch the little? See, it's to say the name is don't whine, then do it like you're whining. Don't whine. It's awfully hard to be Homer, to be a poet, when you have to keep telling people, this is a poem, this is a poem. Or even, I guess, to be Herodotus and say, would you calm down, this is serious. I'm giving you facts now, this ain't tales. To have to tell people, it's a joke, son, it's a joke. Well, it's don't whine would have been it.